I didn't grow up feeling confused. I grew up feeling slightly off, like something in my life never lined up the way it should, but no one else seemed to notice. As a child, I learned early not to ask too many questions. Whenever I did, adults smiled too quickly or changed the subject. I assumed that was normal. I assumed all families had things they didn't talk about. It wasn't until much later that I realized silence can be engineered. The first sign was my name. At home, I was called one thing. At school, another. Not dramatically different, just enough to feel strange. A letter added here. A spelling adjusted there. Teachers brushed it off as clerical error. My parents told me it didn't matter. It's still you, they said. I believed them. When I was young, identity felt flexible. You answered to what people called you. You adapted. You didn't question paperwork because paperwork belonged to adults, and adults were supposed to know what they were doing. But even then, there were moments that made me pause. Forms that took too long to process. Records that needed correction. Doctors who hesitated before calling my name. I remember standing in offices while adults spoke in lowered voices, glancing at me like I wasn't supposed to hear. Just a mix-up, someone would say. It's been handled, someone else would add. Handled. That word followed me through childhood like a reassurance I wasn't allowed to unpack. I didn't know then that identities can be adjusted quietly. That names, dates, even histories can be nudged slightly to serve a purpose that has nothing to do with the person carrying them. I thought identity was something you were born with. I didn't yet understand it could be something assigned. And reassigned. To protect someone else. The second sign came with dates. My birthday never felt settled. Sometimes it was printed one way. Sometimes another. Nothing drastic, just a day earlier here, a month later there. When I pointed it out, I was told. Not to worry. Paperwork gets messy, my mother said once. What matters is the celebration. So we celebrated. Cake. Candles. Photos. Smiles that looked real enough to trust. Still, something about it followed me. When classmates compared astrological signs, mine never seemed to fit. When I filled out forms as a teenager, officials sometimes paused, then shrugged. You sure about this? They'd ask. Yes, I'd say, even when I wasn't. By the time I reached my late teens, I had learned a quiet skill, how to smooth over inconsistencies without understanding them. If a record didn't match, I assumed it was my fault for remembering wrong. It was easier to doubt myself than to doubt the system around me. The first time I saw my full birth certificate, it felt unfamiliar. Not alarming, just distant. Like reading a biography written by someone who had met me only once. My name was there. My parents' names were there. But something about it felt edited. I couldn't explain that feeling to anyone, so I didn't try. I filed it away as discomfort without language. Something you learn to live with. Years later, applying for a job that required extra verification, I was called into a small office and asked to sit down. The man across from me shuffled papers slowly. There seems to be an overlap, he said. An overlap with what? I asked. He looked up, then back down. Another record. Similar details. Another person? He didn't answer right away. Probably nothing, he said finally. These things happen. But this time, the tone was different. This time, he didn't sound convinced. I walked out of that building with the same uneasy feeling I'd had as a child, the sense that something important was being adjusted just out of my reach. I didn't know yet that this overlap wasn't accidental. It was intentional. And it wasn't meant to protect me. I tried to forget about that meeting. That's what you do when something feels too big but too vague at the same time. You tell yourself it was a misunderstanding. You let routine bury the discomfort. You keep going. For a while, it worked. Life moved forward. I finished my studies. I started working. I built friendships where no one questioned my name or my past. In day-to-day life, identity is rarely challenged. You exist as long as no one looks too closely. The problem is, eventually, someone always does. It happened when I applied for a passport renewal. I'd done it before, years earlier, without issue. This time, the process stalled. Days turned into weeks. Then I received a letter asking me to appear in person. The office was quiet, fluorescent lit, impersonal. A woman sat across from me with my file open in front of her. She didn't smile. "We need to clarify a few inconsistencies," she said. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Inconsistencies with what? I asked. She turned the file slightly so I could see. Side by side were two records. Both had my face attached to them. Both had my parents' names. Both had overlapping dates. But the names weren't identical. Neither were the identifiers. "These records belong to two different individuals," she said. "But they've been linked to the same life." I laughed once, quietly. "That's not possible." She looked at me evenly. "It happens more often than you think." I left the office that day shaken in a way I couldn't explain to anyone. Not fear, something worse. Disorientation. It felt like standing on a floor that suddenly revealed it had never been bolted down. That night, I called my parents. Not angrily. Not accusingly. Just tired. "I need you to tell me the truth," I said. "About my documents. About my name. About why nothing ever fully matches." Silence stretched on the line. Then my father spoke. "It was done to keep you safe," he said. Those words hit me harder than any denial could have. "Safe from what?" I asked. He hesitated. "Not what. Who?" And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. My identity hadn't been changed by mistake. It had been changed on purpose. To shield someone else from consequences I didn't even know existed. I didn't push him right away. When someone finally admits that something was done, not misfiled, you feel the shift immediately. The room changes. The past changes. Even the silence changes shape. "Who?" I asked again, slower this time. My father exhaled, the sound long and heavy, like he'd been carrying it in his chest for years. "It's not simple," he said. "It never is," I replied. "But it's still my life." Another pause. Then, quietly, "It was your uncle." The word landed awkwardly. Not shocking, just unsettling. My uncle had always been complicated. Charismatic when he wanted to be. Absent when it mattered. He drifted in and out of family events like someone who never planned to stay long enough to be remembered clearly. "What did he do?" I asked. My father didn't answer directly. He was involved in something he shouldn't have been. And when things started to surface, the timing overlapped with your birth. My stomach tightened. Overlapped how? There were records. Witnesses. Documents that could be traced. Someone needed to disappear on paper. I felt a slow, cold realization creep in. "You're telling me my identity was adjusted so his wouldn't be exposed. It wasn't meant to follow you forever," my father said quickly. "It was supposed to be temporary." Temporary. That word felt almost insulting. How long was temporary supposed to last? I asked. "Until things settled," he said. "Until the risk passed." "And did it?" I asked. He didn't answer. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, realizing something that made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. Everyone had moved on. Except me. The risk had passed for him. The protection had worked for him. But the altered identity, the overlaps, the inconsistencies, the quiet corrections, had stayed attached to my life. "Did he know?" I asked. "Yes, my father said. He agreed to it. That hurt more than I was prepared for, not because I expected better from him, but because it meant my life had been negotiated without my existence ever being part of the discussion. I wasn't protected. I was used. And for the first time since this all began, anger finally arrived, not explosive, not loud, but steady and sharp. The kind that doesn't rush. The kind that waits. Anger didn't make me reckless. It made me precise. For years, I had learned how to live around confusion. Now that I understood its source, I wanted facts, not explanations wrapped in concern. I wanted to see exactly where my life had been edited and how deep those edits went. I asked my father for everything. Old files. Letters. Copies of documents he had kept just in case. He didn't argue. He didn't try to soften it. He brought a box the next time we met and set it down between us like something that had finally grown too heavy to carry alone. Inside were papers I had never seen before. Forms with crossed-out names. Dates overwritten in different ink. Identification numbers that had been amended just enough to redirect attention without raising alarms. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would stand out to someone who wasn't looking closely. That was the point. They hadn't erased me. They had blurred me. It was only supposed to cover a few years, my father said. After that, we thought everything would be corrected. By who? I asked. He didn't have an answer. I noticed something else as I went through the documents, a pattern. Every change benefited the same person. Every overlap redirected scrutiny away from him. Every correction created just enough uncertainty that no single record could stand alone as proof. My life had become the margin where other people's risks were absorbed. What was he facing? I asked. My father looked away. Charges. Serious ones. He was young, reckless. The family thought protecting him was the only way to keep everything from falling apart. So they chose me. I said. No, he replied quickly. They chose the path that seemed easiest. That distinction mattered. It meant no one had stood up and said, use her. They had simply let it happen. And that, somehow, felt worse. I went home that night and laid the documents out on my table. I looked at my name, or rather, the versions of it, scattered across years of paperwork. Slight changes. Quiet decisions. A life shaped by administrative convenience. I realized then that my anger wasn't about the crime. It was about consent. No one had asked me. No one had told me. No one had planned for the person who would have to live with the consequences once the danger passed. They had changed my identity to protect someone else. And then they had expected me to grow into it without noticing the seams. Once you see the seams, you can't unsee them. I started noticing them everywhere, not just in documents, but in memories. Moments that had never made sense before suddenly rearranged themselves into something clearer. The awkward pauses when officials double-checked my details. The way my parents had discouraged me from applying for certain things. The quiet relief when something went through without question. They hadn't been overprotective. They had been afraid. I began requesting my own records. Not casually, formally. Birth records. School transfers. Medical histories. Anything that touched my name or my date of birth. Some requests were denied. Others came back incomplete. A few arrived with notes that said things like record unavailable or file archived under alternate identifier. Alternate identifier. That phrase followed me for weeks. I learned quickly that correcting an identity isn't like fixing a typo. Every change branches into another system. Another office. Another version of you that exists somewhere else. Untangling it meant pulling on threads that had been tied decades ago by people who were no longer available or willing to explain. At one office, a woman. leaned back in her chair after reviewing my paperwork and said, "This is layered. Layered. Not wrong. Not illegal. Just layered. Can it be fixed?" I asked. She hesitated. "It can be clarified," she said. "But it will take time. And you'll need to be prepared for questions." Questions didn't scare me. What scared me was how much of my life existed in those layers, how many choices I had made based on a version of myself that had been quietly shaped by someone else's fear. I thought about my uncle often during that time. Not with rage, with distance. He had built a life after being protected. Moved on. Changed cities. Started over. The shield had worked. And I had carried it. I realized something uncomfortable then. Protection that costs someone else their identity isn't protection. It's transfer. The danger hadn't disappeared. It had been handed off. And now, decades later, it was finally landing where it always should have, with the truth. I didn't know yet what reclaiming my identity would look like. But I knew one thing with certainty. I wasn't going to keep carrying consequences that were never mine to begin with. Deciding to stop carrying it didn't mean I knew how to put it down. I started by telling one person outside my family. Not for advice, just to hear the story spoken out loud without being softened. As I explained the overlaps, the edits, the way my name had been shifted like a piece on a board, I watched their face change. "That's not just messy," they said. "That's deliberate." Hearing it framed that way steadied me. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't misreading the past. Something had been done to me, quietly, and I was allowed to name it. I contacted a legal clinic next. Not to accuse anyone, but to understand my options. The woman I spoke with listened carefully, asked precise questions, and took notes without interruption. "This kind of thing usually starts with good intentions," she said. "But good intentions don't cancel long-term harm." She explained what I could request, what could be corrected, and what might never fully align. Some records could be amended. Others would carry footnotes. Some systems would update. Others would always lag behind. "You'll need patience," she said. "And proof." Proof. That word used to make me tired. Now it made me focused. I began assembling my own history. Not the edited one, the lived one. Photos. School awards. Letters. Anything that showed continuity of me beyond identifiers. It felt strange, building a case for my own existence, but also grounding. During that time, my uncle reached out. He hadn't spoken to me in years. His message was brief. Careful. "Your father told me you know." I stared at it for a long time before responding. "I do," he replied minutes later. "I never meant for it to follow you." I didn't answer right away. Intent had already taken enough space. What mattered now was impact. And the impact had been a life lived slightly out of alignment, always adjusting, always accommodating, never fully sure why. I realized then that reclaiming my identity wasn't about confrontation. It was about correction. Not revenge. Not exposure. Just putting things back where they belonged. Including the responsibility. Correction is slow. It asks you to stay present long after the shock has faded. I replied to my uncle the next day. Not with anger. Not with forgiveness. "I'm fixing what was changed. I won't carry this anymore." He wrote back once more. "I understand. I'm sorry." I read that word carefully. Sorry doesn't undo decades. But it does confirm awareness. After that, he didn't contact me again. The work became procedural. Appointments. Forms. Explanations repeated to people who had no emotional stake in the outcome. I learned how to speak about my life in neutral language, how to translate harm into administrative terms. This identifier doesn't align. This record reflects an intentional alteration. This needs correction. Saying it that way kept me. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when a clerk would look at me with confusion, or suspicion, or quiet disbelief. I learned to breathe through those moments. To remember that clarity doesn't always arrive with sympathy. At home, I sorted through my past like an archivist. I labeled folders. I wrote timelines. I created a version of my story that could stand up to scrutiny without losing its truth. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Anger had brought me to the door, but resolve carried me through it. I wasn't trying to become someone new. I was trying to return to something that had always been mine but never fully acknowledged. One evening, my father asked softly, "Are you okay?" I thought about it before answering. "Yes," I said. "I'm finally being accurate." That seemed to ease something in him. Accuracy has a weight to it. It asks people to adjust, to accept that the version they lived with was incomplete. But it also brings relief. Because once the truth is named, no one has to keep pretending. And I was done pretending. Accuracy changed how I felt in my own skin. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But slowly, in small moments that surprised me. Filling out a form without hesitating. Saying my full name out loud without bracing for correction. Looking at my documents and knowing they were finally moving toward alignment. The process was still ongoing, but something inside me had settled. I stopped feeling like a placeholder. For most of my life, I had adapted, adjusted, explained away inconsistencies as inconvenience. I had learned how to be flexible in places where I shouldn't have had to be. Now, that flexibility was no longer required. I thought often about the person I might have been if none of this had happened. If my identity had never been shifted, if my records had matched cleanly from the start. But that curiosity didn't turn into regret. Because I couldn't undo the past. I could only decide how much power it would keep. There were moments when sadness surfaced unexpectedly. Not loud, not overwhelming, just a quiet recognition of how much energy it takes to live slightly misaligned. How much confidence is lost in small increments when the world keeps asking you to verify yourself. I felt compassion for my younger self. The child who accepted corrections without understanding them. The teenager who learned not to argue with systems. The adult who carried uncertainty like a personal flaw. None of that had been weakness. It had been survival. One afternoon, I received an updated document in the mail. It wasn't perfect. There were still notes, still cross-references, still signs of the past clinging to the present. But my name was right. My date was right. For the first time, the center held. I placed the document on the table and sat with it for a while. Not celebrating. Not grieving. Just acknowledging that something essential had shifted back into place. I wasn't finished yet. But I was no longer invisible inside my own life. And that felt like progress I could stand on. Progress has a quiet sound to it. It's the sound of papers sliding into order. Of explanations getting shorter. Of fewer raised eyebrows when you state who you are. I hadn't realized how much of my energy had been spent preparing for doubt until doubt stopped showing up so often. I walked into offices now with a different posture. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just present. Some officials still asked questions. They had to. The past doesn't disappear just because you name it. But the tone had changed. I wasn't a problem to be solved anymore. I was a person correcting a record. That distinction mattered. One afternoon, while waiting in a government office, I watched people around me clutch folders the way I used to. Tight, anxious, braced for resistance. I recognized that feeling instantly. It made me gentler, less impatient with the slowness of the process. Because I knew what it cost to get here. At home, I started discarding things I no longer needed. Old copies. Duplicates. proof gathered for battles that were already over. Letting go of them felt symbolic, like shedding a version of myself that had lived in constant readiness. My father noticed. "You seem lighter," he said once. "I am," I replied. "Not because it's finished. Because it's finally honest." He nodded. He didn't say much after that. Some realizations don't need commentary. I thought about my uncle less now. Not because I had forgiven him, and not because I was still angry. He simply no longer occupied the center of my story. Protection had given him a future. Correction was giving me mine. That balance didn't feel fair, but it felt real. And real was something I had learned to value more than comfort. Realness changes how you remember things. Memories that once felt uncertain began to settle into place. Not because they changed, but because I no longer questioned my right to trust them. The doubt that had followed me for so long wasn't gone entirely, but it no longer sat at the center of every thought. I began telling my story differently when it came up at all. Not as something strange that happened to me, but as something I lived through and outgrew. That shift mattered. I noticed it especially when people asked routine questions. "Where are you from? What's your background? How long have you lived here?" Questions I used to answer cautiously now came easily. I didn't overthink. I didn't hedge. I spoke from where I stood. There were still days when the past felt heavy. When a document came back marked pending or requires further review. Those moments reminded me that systems move slowly, and truth doesn't always speed them up. But I no longer felt trapped inside those delays. I had learned something important through all of this. Identity isn't just what's written down. It's what you defend when it's questioned. It's what you reclaim when it's misused. One evening, sorting through the last of the old paperwork, I found a note written in my father's handwriting. Short. Unremarkable. "We thought this was the safest way." I stared at it for a long time. Safety had been the reason given for everything. Safety for the family. Safety for my uncle. Safety for the future. But no one had asked what safety meant for me. I folded the note and placed it back in the box, not because it mattered anymore, but because it belonged to the story as it had been lived. Not the story I was living now. I wasn't angry when I thought about it anymore. I was clear. And clarity, I was learning, is far more powerful than anger ever is. Clarity has a way of simplifying things without making them smaller. I stopped trying to explain myself to people who weren't part of the process. I learned that not everyone needs the full story, and not every question deserves a detailed answer. Some truths are personal not because they're secret, but because they're settled. The corrections continued in the background. A letter here. A confirmation there. Each one felt less like a victory and more like a return. As if I were walking back into rooms I had always belonged in but had been asked to stand outside of. I noticed how differently I carried my name now. I said it without hesitation. I wrote it without checking twice. I heard it spoken back to me without that familiar pause. Those moments were small, but they stacked up. And together, they changed how I occupied my own life. There was still one conversation I hadn't had. Not because I owed it to anyone, but because I needed to close a loop. I met my uncle once more. Not privately. Not emotionally. Just a brief meeting, in a public place, with nothing hidden. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller. The confidence he once carried had worn thin. "I never thought it would follow you this long," he said. "I know," I replied. "That wasn't enough," he added, quietly. "No," I said. "It wasn't." We didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue about. The truth was already doing its work, not loudly, not publicly, but thoroughly. I left that meeting without satisfaction and without regret. Some endings don't offer either. What they offer is finality. And finality, I realized, doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it just feels like walking away without looking back. Walking away didn't feel like loss. It felt like alignment. For the first time, I wasn't carrying someone else's urgency on my back. I wasn't making room for other people's fears or unfinished decisions. The past had been acknowledged, addressed, and set where it belonged, behind me, not beneath me. I noticed how my days felt steadier now. Not lighter in a careless way, steadier in a grounded one. I trusted my instincts more. I stopped second-guessing details that used to trip me up. When something didn't make sense, I asked about it directly instead of assuming I was mistaken. That alone changed everything. The corrections reached a point where there were fewer updates than before. Silence returned, but this time, it wasn't hiding anything. It was just the absence of chaos. The kind you don't notice until you realize you're no longer bracing for impact. One afternoon, I opened a drawer and found an old ID card I had kept without knowing why. The name was close to mine, but not quite. The date was almost right. The photo was unmistakably me. I held it for a moment, then slid it into the shredder. Not out of anger. Out of completion. That version of me had done its job, surviving, adapting, absorbing consequences that weren't hers. She didn't need to keep standing guard anymore. I also noticed how my relationship with my parents changed. Not dramatically, just honestly. We didn't circle around topics anymore. We didn't protect each other from truths that had already been spoken. There was relief in that. Not forgiveness. Not blame. Relief. We had finally stopped pretending the past was tidy, and in doing so, we made room for a present that was. Tidiness had never been the goal. Honesty was. Once everything stopped being managed in whispers, I felt a quiet confidence settle in me. Not the loud kind that announces itself, the steady kind that shows up when nothing is pulling you in opposite directions anymore. I didn't realize how much of my personality had been shaped by adjustment. By learning to be flexible where I should have been firm. By smoothing over moments that deserved clarity. Now, without that constant need to adapt, I was learning who I was underneath it all. It felt unfamiliar at first. I spoke more directly. I paused less before answering questions. I trusted my own memory without needing confirmation. These weren't dramatic changes. No one around me commented on them. But I noticed. And that was enough. One evening, sitting alone, I thought about the version of myself that had carried this altered identity for so long. The child who accepted corrections without explanation. The teenager who learned not to argue with forms. The adult who quietly absorbed friction and called it normal. I felt grateful to that version of me. She had done what she needed to do to survive in a life that had been quietly complicated. She had kept going without knowing why things felt harder than they should. And now, she could rest. I realized then that reclaiming my identity wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about no longer betraying myself to keep others comfortable. That line felt important. I had spent years accommodating a story that wasn't mine. Now, I was living inside one that was. And it felt right. Not perfect. Not untouched. Just right. Rightness has a quiet gravity to it. I noticed it in how I made decisions now. I no longer checked them against other people's comfort or convenience. I asked a simpler question instead: does this align with who I actually am? If the answer was yes, I moved forward. If it wasn't, I didn't. That clarity saved me realize I'd been losing. I stopped apologizing for asking questions. Stopped shrinking when someone in authority spoke confidently but vaguely. I had learned what vague confidence could hide. I had lived inside its consequences. So I asked for specifics. I asked for documentation. I asked for truth, plainly. Most people responded well to that. A few didn't. And that, too, told me what I needed to know. The final corrections came in stages. A confirmation letter. Then another. Some systems updated quickly. Others lagged behind, stubborn and slow. But the direction was clear now. There was no more overlap. No more borrowed shadow following me through official spaces. I was no longer absorbing someone else's risk. One afternoon, I sat with my father and went through the last of the documents together. We didn't talk much. There was nothing left to defend. I wish I had done this sooner, he said quietly. I know, I replied. But I'm doing it now. That seemed to ease something between us. It wasn't forgiveness he needed. It was resolution. I understood then that people don't always choose wrongly because they're careless. Sometimes they choose wrongly because they're afraid, and fear narrows vision until the easiest path looks like the only one. That understanding didn't excuse what had been done, but it allowed me to put it down without bitterness. And when I finally did, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was finally mine. Relief didn't make me sentimental. It made me practical. Once the weight lifted, I could see my life more clearly, not as a series of disruptions, but as something coherent that had survived despite being bent out of shape. I didn't feel the need to rewrite my past or reinterpret every memory. Most of it still belonged to me, unchanged. What had changed was my relationship with authority. I no longer assumed systems were neutral just because they were official. I had seen how easily paperwork could be used to redirect attention, how rules could be applied selectively when the right people were being protected. That knowledge didn't make me cynical. It made me attentive. I read things carefully now. I asked who benefited from certain decisions. I noticed whose inconvenience was being treated as acceptable, and whose was treated as urgent. And I noticed, too, how often inconvenience had been assigned to me without anyone calling it that. There was a moment, weeks later, when I was asked to verify my identity for something minor, nothing important, nothing dramatic. I handed over my documents without thinking much of it. The person checked them, nodded, and handed them back. All set, they said. No pause. No second look. No correction. I walked out of that building and stood outside for a second longer than necessary, just breathing. For years, moments like that had carried tension. Now, they passed quietly. That quiet felt earned. I realized then that identity isn't just about being recognized by systems. It's about no longer feeling like you have to brace yourself every time recognition is required. I wasn't bracing anymore. And that told me more than any document ever could. Not bracing anymore gave me back a kind of energy I hadn't realized I was missing. I used to move through the world with a small reserve of attention always set aside, just in case something didn't match, just in case I had to explain, just in case I needed to correct someone politely without sounding defensive. That reserve was always there, quietly draining me. Now, it wasn't. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I felt present. I noticed it when I traveled. Airports had always made me uneasy, not because of fear of flying, but because identity is questioned there so casually. Names, dates, numbers. This time, everything flowed. No extra questions. No sideways glances. I realized how much I had internalized the idea that friction was normal. It isn't. Friction is a signal. And mine had been ignored for too long. As the weeks passed, I stopped thinking about my uncle entirely. Not out of forgiveness, and not out of anger. He simply no longer belonged in the center of my story. His mistake had shaped my life for a time, but it did not get to define it. What stayed with me instead was a sharpened sense of responsibility, not to carry other people's secrets, but to refuse them when they're offered in the name of convenience. I thought about how often people justify quiet harm by calling it protection. How easily a temporary solution becomes permanent when the person paying the price is a child, or someone without power. I had been both. And now, I wasn't. One evening, sitting alone, I wrote my name at the top of a page. Slowly. Clearly. No variations. No qualifiers. I looked at it for a long time. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't a declaration. It was recognition. This was who I had always been, even when the world tried to soften the edges or blur the lines to make someone else's life easier. I closed the notebook and felt something settle. Not pride. Not victory. Ownership. Ownership doesn't shout. It steadies you. I noticed how differently I handled conflict after that. Not just the big, obvious ones, the small, everyday moments where people push past boundaries without realizing they're doing it. I stopped absorbing that pressure. I didn't rush to accommodate. I didn't explain myself into corners. I chose clarity over comfort. That choice rippled outward. Friends noticed. Colleagues noticed. Even my parents noticed, though they didn't name it. Conversations felt cleaner now. Shorter. More honest. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was being accurate. There were still reminders of the past. A database that hadn't updated yet. A letter addressed to a near version of my name. Each one registered, then passed. They no longer felt personal. They felt like echoes. Echoes fade. One afternoon, while organizing the last of my files, I came across a timeline I had made early in the process. Dates. Offices. Corrections requested and completed. It looked clinical now, almost impersonal. I realized something then. This hadn't been about paperwork at all. It had been about permission. Permission to stop being the place where other people's problems were stored. Permission to say no to inherited consequences. Permission to stand fully inside my own life. I folded the timeline and put it away. I didn't need it anymore. The story it told had already done its work. And as I moved forward, I carried one simple rule with me, one that had taken years to learn. If a solution requires erasing someone else, it isn't a solution. I had been erased just enough to make things easier for others. Now, I was visible, to myself first, and then to the world. And that visibility felt like the truest form of protection I had ever known. Visibility changed how I think about protection. For most of my life, protection had meant silence. It meant bending so others wouldn't break. It meant carrying consequences quietly so the family could keep moving forward without disruption. I had been told that was love. I had been told it was necessary. Now I understood the difference. Protection that requires your disappearance isn't protection. It's convenience. Once my records were finally aligned, not perfect, not pristine, but honest, I felt something settle that I had never felt before. A sense that I no longer needed to justify my existence to anyone. That my name, my dates, my history belonged to me without footnotes. I didn't celebrate. I didn't mark the day. I simply lived. And that felt like the point all along. My parents adjusted in their own ways. Some days were quiet. Some days were awkward. But there was no longer a secret pressing down on our conversations. What had been hidden was now known, and that knowledge changed the shape of everything. Not for the worse. For the clearer. I don't tell this story often. Not because I'm ashamed of it, and not because it's too painful. I tell it rarely because it no longer defines me. It's something that happened, not something I am. What I am now is someone who understands the cost of shortcuts made in fear. Someone who knows how easily a temporary decision can become a lifelong burden when it's placed on the wrong person. And someone who refuses to carry what isn't theirs anymore. They changed my identity to protect someone else. But in the end, I reclaimed it, not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. And that is how I live now. Present. Accurate. Unhidden.